uncomfortable spots often have to do with big pots where you just don't have the nuts and are facing big bets. However, in this hand, I wanted to cover a hand that is not a big pot, but still very uncomfortable. And I think we can learn one or the other thing for both being hero in this example, which is Prodigy, and also our opponent, which we will see in a second. So this is blind versus blind. We open ace-3 suited here from the small blind, and Kevin Park calls our 3x open. We flop bottom pair on a low board, which is the first uncomfortable situation, right? When we are out of position and are facing a low board, it often means we are not in the best position, especially if we expect a lot of aggression on future streets. But let's not go get ahead of ourselves. Just tackle the first option we have here. So low flops, small blind versus big blind. Mostly we want to be checking just because the big blind's range is, first of all, very wide. And in that wide range are included a lot of hands that are low cards, just because the in-position player gets such a good price being in position to continue a lot of hands that are not only the high cards, but a lot of low cards as well, which we will not have in our range as the small blind. So we will likely not open a hand like 6-5 offsuit here, which will be a much better candidate for the big blind to continue. In this case, that would be the nuts here, but it also applies to hands like 6-7, 7-8 offsuit, also hands like Queen 4 suited or 5-Jack suited, hands which we likely wouldn't open, but the big blind can very well defend here. And another thing is that the big blind will 3-bet a lot of high cards and pocket pairs, so that makes his range even more bottom heavy, because a lot of high cards will not be in the range and 3-bet pre-flop. So on this flop, Prodigy checks, which is, I think, the standard play. We will look into that in a second when we go into the solver and solve the hand. Here we face a bet, and the bet size is half pot here. We will see which will be the most preferred size on this exact flop. In general, from my experience, the big blind will often bet half pot or even bigger. Of course, you can implement a strategy where you step for, let's say, a 1/3 pot. That is not a big mistake if you play your range right. But more often than not, the main sizing would be a little bit bigger, which at the same time makes life for the small blind, or can make life a little bit harder, just because it foreshadows a lot of aggression that is about to come on later streets as well. So here half pot is still, I would say, a rather easy call, even though with bottom pair, no backdoor draws, no straight draws here, we are already not loving life. We are not thinking about folding as much here because we have so many worse hands that have to fold. And if we fold bottom pair here, we fold a lot of our range, which we cannot do. So we just call. Turn is not very welcomed. Flush completes, also ace-5 completes as a straight. Many hands that are in the big blind's range make 2 pairs that we don't have. So a hand like 7 deuce suited, for example, 4 deuce suited will be in the big blind's range, but not in ours. So this card, if anything, rather helps the big blind, because the big blind still has all of the flushes, or not all of them, but a lot of flushes that are possible here, maybe even more than we have, again, just because he can call so many suited hands pre-flop that we wouldn't open as the small blind. So we check again, and we face another bet, another half pot bet, which is probably the worst size we can face here, because if we face a pot bet, for example, here, we are a little bit, or let's say if we face an overbet, we are just more happy to just fold right away. If we face a bigger bet size like pot size or 75, we likely still have to call, but we are maybe on the edge, just because we also have a gut shot here, which is not worth that much because it also completes a 6x straight. But still, half pot is probably the size that we still have to continue, but are not very happy about, just because we will not win the hand that often. If the board doesn't change in our favor, then any bet that we face on the river will likely not be very welcomed by us either, and we just have to fold a lot of the time. Or if our opponent checks, it's not too unlikely they just check behind with a better hand. So we are at the mercy of our opponent. However, in this case, Prodigy decides to check call another time. The river is a queen, which is not too relevant, I would say. Of course, he could just be betting some queen jack, king queen here in position with preferably a diamond. But in terms of connecting with the flop or the turn, the queen isn't really that relevant. It would be more relevant if it was, let's say, another 4, a 5, a 6, another diamond, of course. Any card that connects with this runout would be a little bit more, yeah, let's say we would have to do a little bit more thinking in terms of how it changes the ranges that are in play. So this card likely doesn't change the ranges that much. And yeah, we still have to see what happens, of course. And we do face another half pot bet. And at this point, my first instinct would be that we don't love calling here. At the same time, ranges are just so wide, blind versus blind, that we really have to think about which hands do we can we fold here. Do we have a lot of high cards that check called twice, like let's say ace x with a diamond, for example, that would be much more likely to fold on this river. So do we have to call any pair here? And is a 3x here good enough to call, or can we just stick to just check calling 7x and better, 4x and better, or anything in between? So here Prodigy decides to call. Let's have a look at what happens, or what Kevin has here at the end of this quick run through, just to not be biased, and have a look at what the solver would say and what we can learn from the theory side of this. So as said, a lot of hands are in the opening range here, so almost 46% of hands, but still a lot of offsuit hands. So as I said, these offsuited connectors are not in here, and a bunch of suited cards are still in here. So Jack 5, Queen 4 do actually open. However, a lot of them fold as well. And if we look at the big blinds range, basically any suited hand can continue here. And therefore, the big blinds range is just much wider than ours. At the same time here, these offsuited connectors also continue and are in the range, which they are not in ours. So they call. We see a 6 big blind pot, 97 big blind stacks, so not much to do here. Let's, for the small blind, have a look at what would be the preferred size if we c-bet here. And for the big blind, we'll do that as well. If it's not a half pot c-bet, then we will just change the simulation later on. And let's just go ahead and do that for every street here and then adjust on the way if the sizings are different to what Kevin actually used. 7, 4, 3. So as assumed, the c-betting strategy or the c-betting frequency isn't too high here, less than 8%, which means that in practice it's slightly easier to just range check here, which Prodigy might very well do. He did, as after all, just check here. Who knows what his strategy overall is, but I don't think it's unlikely that players just choose to check everything here. Let's go with this range. Doesn't make too much of a difference. And then for imposition, GTO Wizard chooses 40% here, which is very close to the 50% we see. But just to be accurate, let's just use the 50% one. Frequency will likely go down slightly, but not too much of a difference in terms of range. And this is one perk of these wide ranges, which is that pretty much all hands or hand classes mix betting and checking a lot. Well, if we look at hand classes, then we see that over pairs, sets, and straights, and two pairs, so anything that is an overpair and better, almost always likes to bet. So that is something we can keep in mind here. Anything that is pocket eights and better basically can bet every single time, but everything lower than that just mixes frequencies all over the place with some preference for, let's say, A7. So the higher top pairs can bet more often than the lower ones. Under pairs mix, second pairs mix, again, Ace4 can bet a little bit more often. We also see a preference for the diamonds, which makes a lot of sense because when we have more equity, we want to put more money into the pot. And for the 3x, that is basically the same, not with the direct flush draw, but with the backdoor flush draw. So here the hearts bet more often than the non-hearts. Basically the non-hearts check purely a lot. But again, not all of them. 4-5, for example, is also a gut shot, bets a lot of the time. And then King 3 offsuit, for example, mixes all over the place, again with a slight preference or a rather heavy preference for the King of Diamonds, which is also a backdoor flush draw. So flush draws and backdoor flush draws prefer betting more often than the other combos, and that shows in the ace high region as well, offsuit and suited as well. Probably the same for the king highs. Yep, pretty much. Offsuit too. But overall, just a bunch of mixing, and that makes these wide ranges so hard to play. Because even though the solver says either is right or not too big of a difference in terms of EV, if you mix everything exactly like this, then you're fine, but usually you prefer betting a certain type of hand or checking a certain type of hand more often than the solver would do that, and then your overall range usually shifts towards betting more often or less often than the solver, which makes you be which makes you a little bit more unbalanced overall in these kinds of spots. So that's the difference that we have to tackle as humans. The difficulty, I wanted to say. So against the bet, we again see a lot of mixing here. So let's just go with ace high and lower here. Pretty much all of these or most of these hands that don't have a backdoor flush draw fold all the time or close to all the time. And if we have a diamond here with it, then we can continue. Pretty much the same for the ace X offsuit region. And for the suited region as well. We just want to have a backdoor flush draw, otherwise we cannot continue. Then we also see some raises with direct flush draws here, also with 6x and a flush draw. So these combo draws like to check raise a little bit more, or quite significantly more often than the non-flush draws, which also like to check raise though. So king 5 of spades and clubs, for example, does like to check raise. Then we go to the low pair region, pocket deuces, mixes, third pairs, 3x. That is the type of hand that we have here. Does never fold. And we even see some check raises here as, yeah, probably a hybrid. So a merge check raise. You get called by worse hands, but also maybe no better hands fold yet, but you open yourself up for the opportunity to bluff on later streets, and having a pair as a bluff is pretty cool because you block sets and 2-pair. So that is likely why some of these 3x hands check raise here. The most important part is that we never fold them, and for 4x it's basically the same. Under pairs basically the same. Then for top pairs, the best ones like to check raise. That's a little bit more clearly for value. Over pairs as well, but these also mix heavily. So again, not too easy of a strategy. Sets mostly check raise, but not always. We sometimes like to check call them and just slow play. Straights, however, are just so good that they always want to check raise. Right, and now we get into the more difficult area of the turn. Here we could implement a donking strategy. I'm not sure if Prodigy does that with these guys, you never know. Let's, for this example, assume we are playing on mid stakes and below, where most people likely don't have a donking strategy. So for that purpose, let's just note lock the small blind to never donk bet here. I have to lock these. And then we check, and we see a barreling strategy on the turn that wants to go for 2/3 pot mostly. If we give Kevin the option to bet 50%, we will see what happens then. But if we only use one, then GTO Wizard would choose 2/3, which is of course not too far from the 50% pot size. So here, almost 50-50 in terms of bets and checks. And if we look over the hand classes, we again see a lot of mixing here. Let's not go through every single hand class here, but again, this is one of the parts that is so difficult to get right in practice. In practice, you will see some players just always bet their sets, straights, and flushes, never bluff any of these, I don't know, 10-8 offsuit without a flush draw, which would mix in a lot of bluff bets as well. So in reality, you will see a lot of imbalances here. However, if we expect our opponent to play a GTO strategy, which mixes a lot of bluffs and value bets, then we have a look at what we would do with ace-3, and we already see that here is already the point where we would fold our pair of threes, even with the added gut shots that comes from the ace. And that is something that I said we probably have to call here still, but again, it does feel very uncomfortable, right? So just because there are just so many ways to lose the hand, you either are already behind and you might already be dead, you might be behind and have little equity, you might be slightly ahead and still lose to a lot of turn cards, you might be slightly ahead and lose to your opponent barreling the river and then folding the best hand, and you might also just be ahead like significantly. I don't know, how often are you ahead here, like really, how often are you really far ahead of your opponent? Not too often, I would say. And that's what makes this spot so uncomfortable, because you are in such a bad place, but this size might convince you have that you have to call here some amount of the time. However, in GTO, we can see that even a lot of second pairs already check fold here. So even 4x check folds a lot of the time, and only those with an added gut shot can continue here, or an added flush draw, basically. And then anything that is better than that can basically always call. But we even see some top pairs fold here. So 7-8 without a flush draw also mixes in some folds, which just goes to show that on these kinds of boards, we really want to have additional equity in terms of draws, gut shots, and flush draws that make our hand, or have the potential to make our hand, a little bit closer to a nut hand on the river. Overpairs, however, never fold, and that is likely because in position would still bet a lot of hands that are top pairs. Yep. Whereas those lower pairs don't bet that often, so we don't beat a lot of value if we have the worst top pairs here in the spot. And that's what makes the difference between pocket eights and a weak 7, like 7-8. So, of course, in the GTO, we wouldn't ever get to the river here. However, let's have a look at what we would do here. Again, solver would implement a donking strategy, which I would say is rather unlikely to happen in practice. So, wait. Can I not? No. Why can I not? Come on. What is happening? Can I not change this frequency? Is that why? Yes. All right. And so on the river, we see that imposition would actually polarize a lot more than they did in reality. So here, an overbet would only be used 150%, even some all-ins, but that is not happening too often. So then they would bet straights and flushes and ace highs and worse. So all of these likely contain flushed blockers, all these bluffs. Yep. Well, not all of them. So these hearts can also bluff here, which are straight blockers. And yeah, against that, we have a pretty easy decision if we ever get to this spot with ace 3. Here, the solver mixes in 0.5% of a call here, which is likely just an inaccuracy. So here, against that size, we have a very easy life. And that is what I was saying. If we face a big bet on this river, or even on a turn, our life would be very easy because we just know we can fold and just call better hands and not be overfolding. However, if we face a smaller bet size, like the 50% we face here, then life would probably look different. And that is actually the case. So now ace-3, if we made it this far with this hand, would actually become a pure call. However, this strategy also looks very complex just because we can see some overpairs already fold. So pocket kings would fold sometimes, underpairs fold, top pairs, second pairs, no, not top pairs, second pairs and third pairs mix in a lot of folds. And a lot of that probably comes down to blocker effects. Because here we can see if imposition uses a smaller size, then they could also bet wider for value. So not only straights and flushes would be included in the betting range, but also sets and two pair. And if sets and two pair are in there, then those lower pairs in our range as the small blind are actually worth more because they block these hands. So especially pocket fours, threes, are in here for full frequency or close to full frequency for the big blind. Also hands like 7-3 and then some of these two pair hands as well. And when that is the case, then having 3x is worth more for us than having an overpair, for example, because Jack X or pocket jacks, pocket tens, pocket nines probably even block more bluffs in our opponent's range than value hands. So these Jack 9, 10 9, Jack 8, 10 8, 9 8, those would be bluffs a lot of the time. And if we have those cards in our range, if we have those hands here, then we block a lot of bluffs. Again, everything comes down to how does our opponent construct their range. But if we see a half pot bet here on the river, then at least it's not unlikely to, or it's not too far off to assume that Kevin would bet a lot more sets and a lot more two pair here on the river than if he were to use an overbet size. And if that is the case, then any pair becomes a better bluff catcher, which is basically what this hand is. It's a pure bluff catcher. We never beat anything that is a value bet here, of course. So that's probably why I can only assume Prodigy made the call down here. And let's have a look at what Kevin had. He did have a bluff, King Jack with the King of Diamonds. It's probably never a bad play to just barrel it through here. And we can see on the flop, King Jack. Yeah, it starts betting sometimes. Wait, no, that's a small blind, sorry. It starts, it's very close actually. So sometimes stabs here on the flop, not too often though. I would have guessed it would be higher. So these lower ones actually bet more often on the flop. King Jack is apparently good enough to check behind a lot of the time. But then when we get to the river, we see a barrel a little bit more often. Can, of course, be the case that this happens more often than these 40% and these 8% of the time on the flop. If Kevin stabs a lot more often with these kinds of hands and barrels them more often on the turn, then there is a very good case to be made for Prodigy to make this call down, especially on the turn where this hand would be a fold most of the time in GTO. But if our opponent bluffs more often with these overcards, then we can call down a lot more, of course. And on the river, we see that King Jack does actually check down. So it doesn't bluff. Bluffs would come from more of the lower hands, so Jack X and lower, and also those King X that would bluff are blocking straights, so King 6 and King 5. Otherwise, it would be too many bluffs apparently. Again, if that is what is happening more often here. So at least the river bet we can see is an overbluff with this exact hand. Doesn't mean he also overbluffs with his complete range. Maybe he checks behind some other hands in exchange of king jack, but maybe he doesn't. And then bluff catching with ace 3 all the way through is actually a winning play. What do you think about this? Do you think players on mid stakes and below find more bluffs on these structures? What do you think about the sizings? Are these more often value bets, or do players actually find bluffs with these sizes? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.